The autumn of 1885 brought the deadliest typhoid outbreak the Wyoming Territory had ever witnessed. Temperatures soared to unbearable heights as the sickness spread through town after town, leaving devastation in its wake. It was in these merciless conditions that Abigail Carter found herself alone in a dilapidated stagecoach station, her husband freshly buried, with a dangerously high fever and no way to seek help. Her supplies were dwindling and hope fading with each labored breath. Abigail had resigned herself to the cruel fate that seemed inevitable until a shadow appeared at her door. A mysterious gunslinger named Nathaniel Hayes, on the run from his own dark past, would make a discovery that would forever alter the course of two desperate lives. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The scorching heat pressed down on the small stagecoach station. Like a physical weight, Abigail Carter pushed her sweat-soaked hair from her forehead and stared through the dust-covered window, watching as heat waves rose from the barren ground outside. Just 3 weeks earlier, her life had been full of promise. She and her husband Daniel had journeyed west from Boston with dreams of establishing a hotel and restaurant in the booming railroad town of Silver Creek in the Wyoming Territory. A modest plot of land they'd purchased sat near the planned railroad junction, and Daniel had worked tirelessly to secure investment for their business venture. But Daniel had never lived to see their dreams fulfilled. 5 days after arriving in Silver Creek, the typhoid that had been sweeping through the territory struck him down. Within a week, he was gone, leaving Abigail alone in an unfamiliar wilderness with the disease now burning through her own body. She'd managed to hire a local man to drive her to the next town where a doctor might help, but her condition had worsened on the journey. When they'd stopped at this abandoned stagecoach station for the night, her driver had become spooked by her deteriorating state and the rumors of raiders in the area. He'd fled with the wagon before dawn, leaving her stranded with nothing but the bag of supplies they'd brought. The stagecoach station had been abandoned months ago when the new railroad line made this route obsolete. It consisted of a single room with a small counter where tickets had once been sold, a few broken chairs, and a storage area in the back where Abigail had made herself a rudimentary bed from old horse blankets. The well outside still had water, which had been her only blessing. Abigail's body ached with the fever. She hadn't been able to keep food down for 2 days, and her throat was so raw from coughing that swallowing water had become an exercise in agony. According to her pocket watch, it was only midday, but the light hurt her eyes as if it were beating directly on her face. "You have to move," she whispered to herself, knowing that lying in the same position for too long would only make her weaker. With tremendous effort, she pushed herself to a sitting position, fighting the wave of dizziness that threatened to drag her back down. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath her as she finally managed to stand. Every muscle in her body protested as she shuffled toward the small barrel of water she'd managed to fill from the well yesterday before the worst of the day's fever had set in. Abigail's hands trembled as she dipped the ladle into the water. She brought it to her cracked lips and took a small sip, wincing as the liquid slid down her raw throat. Each swallow was a battle, but she forced herself to take several more sips, knowing that the fever would cook her alive without water. Her mind wandered to the letter she'd written to her sister back east. Even in the best conditions, mail took weeks to reach Massachusetts from Wyoming Territory. No help would come from that direction in time. And the nearest town, Blackwater, was 15 miles away, an impossible journey on foot in her condition. The afternoon stretched on. The temperature climbed even higher. Abigail added the last of her small medicine supply to a cup of water, the fever powders Daniel had purchased in Kansas City during their journey west. She'd been rationing them carefully, but now only dust remained in the small paper packet. She slumped back onto her makeshift bed, a ragged quilt beneath her and a thin blanket over her legs despite the heat, as the chills of fever made her shiver, one moment and burn the next. Through the station's dirty window, she could see the sun beginning its slow descent toward the horizon. Soon it would be dark again, another night of fever dreams and disorientation, with no one to help her if she worsened. Miles away across the sun-baked plains, Nathaniel Hayes rode slowly, preserving his horse's strength in the punishing heat. His black Stetson was pulled low over his eyes, and the bandana around his neck was soaked with sweat. The Winchester rifle in its saddle scabbard and the Colt revolver holstered at his hip were as much a part of him as his own limbs, worn smooth from years of use. At 34 years old, Nathaniel's face bore the weathered lines of a man who had seen too much too soon. A scar ran from the corner of his left eye down to his jawline, a permanent reminder of a knife fight in a Tucson saloon years ago. His dark beard was streaked with premature gray, and his eyes, when visible beneath the brim of his hat, held the watchful wariness of a man accustomed to danger. He hadn't intended to venture this far north. The poster with his face and the words, "Wanted 500 reward," had been circulating in Colorado for months after the incident at the Silver Dollar Mine. The shooting had been self-defense. The mine foreman had drawn first when Nathaniel questioned the missing wages of the Mexican workers, but with the foreman being the governor's cousin, justice didn't factor into the equation. Nathaniel had been moving steadily northward, taking odd jobs where he could, and avoiding towns whenever possible. He'd been working as a ranch hand in southern Wyoming when word reached them about the typhoid outbreak spreading through the territory. The ranch owner had paid the hands early and closed down operations until the danger passed. Now, Nathaniel found himself alone on the trail, heading toward the Montana border where he hoped to lose himself in the vast wilderness. His canteen was running low, and his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Dust, needed rest. According to his map, there should be an old stagecoach station a few miles ahead, abandoned now that the railroad had come through, but likely to still have a well. As the afternoon light began to soften, Nathaniel spotted the station in the distance. It was a simple wooden structure, its paint long ago stripped away by wind and sun. No smoke rose from the chimney, and no horses were visible in the small corral, good signs that the place was uninhabited as he'd hoped. When he was about 100 yards out, Nathaniel reined Dust to a stop and surveyed the area carefully. Years on the run had taught him caution. He studied the building, noting the closed door and dust-covered windows. A bucket sat by the well, and nearby lay what looked like a woman's shawl, incongruous against the barren dirt. Nathaniel frowned. The shawl suggested recent human presence. He drew his rifle from its scabbard and approached slowly, alert for any sign of danger. When he was 30 yards out, he dismounted and tied Dust to a scrubby juniper, allowing the horse a long lead to graze on what little vegetation grew nearby. Moving with practiced silence despite his spurs, Nathaniel approached the station. He circled the building once, noting the undisturbed dust except for a single set of small footprints, too small to be a man's, leading from the well to the door. Someone was inside, and recently. Inside the station, Abigail startled at the sound of footsteps crunching in the dirt outside. Her heart raced with both hope and fear. Visitors could mean salvation, but this was still frontier country where danger often arrived unannounced. She reached for Daniel's derringer, which she kept loaded by her makeshift bed, though in her weakened state she doubted her ability to aim it effectively. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper, her throat too raw to manage more. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door, followed by a moment of silence. Then came a light knock. "Hello in there," called a deep male voice, neutral and controlled. "I'm just looking for water and a place to rest my horse." Abigail hesitated, the small pistol clutched in her trembling hand. The world swam before her eyes as another wave of fever washed over her. If this man meant her harm, she had no real defense in her condition. But if he was just a traveler, he might be her only chance of survival. "I'm opening the door," she managed to call out, her voice breaking. "I'm sick with the fever, please." She broke off, coughing painfully. "Please, don't come near if you fear infection." With tremendous effort, she staggered to her feet and made her way to the door, still clutching the derringer. Her vision blurred, and she leaned heavily against the wall as she worked the latch with her free hand. When the door swung open, Abigail found herself face to face with a tall man unlike any she had encountered before. He stood a few paces back from the door, rifle held at his side but not aimed at her. His clothes were trail-worn but not ragged, dark trousers tucked into high boots, a faded blue shirt under a leather vest, and a black Stetson that shadowed his face. Most striking were his eyes, a startling pale blue that seemed to assess her condition in a single glance. "Ma'am," he said, keeping his voice even and his hands visible, "my name is Nathaniel Hayes. I was just looking for water, but it appears you need help." Abigail stared at him, swaying slightly from fatigue and fever. "I'm Abigail Carter," she finally responded, the derringer drooping in her grasp. "My husband. He died of the fever in Silver Creek. I've caught it too. The driver left me here 2 days ago." Her voice broke. "I can't keep down food. I'm nearly out of water. I don't know what to do." Nathaniel nodded solemnly. "May I come in? I have some medical supplies and food. I've survived typhoid once before, so I'm not afraid of catching it again." Abigail stepped back, allowing him entry. As Nathaniel moved into the station, he took note of her makeshift bed in the corner, the nearly empty water barrel, and the complete lack of proper medical supplies or food. This woman would not have survived another day without intervention. "First, we need to cool you down and get more water into you," Nathaniel said matter-of-factly, setting down his rifle and removing his pack. "Then I'll see about making this place more habitable." Abigail watched as the stranger efficiently moved to the water barrel, checking its contents before turning back to her. "You should lie down, Mrs. Carter. I'll fetch fresh water from the—" Well, without another word, he went outside. Minutes later, he returned with a bucket of cool water. "This will burn, but it helps," he explained, soaking a bandana in the water and offering it to her. "Put this on your forehead, small sips of water only, even if you're parched." Abigail felt tears welling in her eyes, the first she had allowed herself since burying Daniel. "Thank you," she whispered, taking the damp cloth. "I don't know how." "To repay you." Nathaniel shook his head. "No payment necessary. No decent person leaves another to die alone." He glanced around the dismal station. "Rest now. I'll tend to my horse and then improve our situation here." As Abigail lay back down, the cool cloth bringing blessed relief to her burning skin, she observed Nathaniel through half-closed eyes. Despite his rough appearance and the weapons he carried with obvious familiarity, there was something reassuring about his calm competence. For the first time in days, she felt a small flicker of hope that she might survive. Outside, Nathaniel unsaddled Dust and led him to the small corral behind the station. As he worked, his mind calculated their situation. The woman was in the grip of typhoid, the same disease that had swept through his army unit during the war. He'd been one of the few to survive it, left with an immunity that now allowed him to help her without fear, but helping her complicated his plans. He'd intended to stop only briefly before continuing north, staying ahead of the wanted posters and the bounty hunters who might be tempted by the $500 reward. Nursing a woman through typhoid would mean staying in one place for days, perhaps weeks, yet the alternative, leaving her to certain death, wasn't something he could bring himself to do, regardless of the risk to himself. Too many deaths already shadowed his path. He wouldn't add another that he could prevent. With dust settled with grain from his saddlebags, Nathaniel returned to the station. He moved quietly, seeing that Abigail had fallen into a restless sleep. Good rest was what she needed most. He set about improving their situation with practiced efficiency. First, he cleared the accumulated dust and debris from the small station. Then he arranged his bedroll on the floor near the door, establishing a clear boundary that he hoped would put her at ease when she woke. From his saddlebags, he produced dried meat, hardtack, and most importantly a small bottle of laudanum and some willow bark for her fever and pain. As sunset painted the sky in brilliant hues outside the dirty window, Nathaniel sat on his bedroll, cleaning his revolver. A habit so ingrained he performed it daily without thought. His eyes regularly moved to the sleeping woman, watching the rise and fall of her chest to ensure she still breathed. Looking at her flushed face, he was struck by how young she appeared, perhaps in her mid-20s, and by the gold wedding band that still circled her finger. The dead husband she'd mentioned had left her to face this harsh territory alone, just as Nathaniel himself had been alone since Sarah and their unborn child had died in the Colorado mining town 5 years ago. He pushed the painful memory away. The past couldn't be changed. Only the present moment mattered, and in this moment his duty was clear. Keep this woman alive until she was strong enough to reach civilization, then continue his journey north before his own past caught up with him. As night fell completely, Abigail stirred, moaning softly as she returned to consciousness and the awareness of her fever. Nathaniel moved to her side, offering a cup with water mixed with willow bark. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Drink this," he said quietly. "It's bitter, but will help with the fever." Abigail's eyes fluttered open, momentary confusion giving way to recognition. "You're still here," she whispered, her voice slightly stronger than before. "I thought, perhaps, I dreamed of you." "I'm real enough," Nathaniel replied, helping her sit up to drink, "and I'll stay until you're able to travel." Her hands trembled as she took the cup, but she managed several small sips before lying back, exhausted by even this small effort. "Why would you help a stranger?" she asked, studying his face in the dim light of the single lantern he'd lit. Nathaniel was silent for a moment. "Because out here, no one survives alone," he finally said, "and because I've seen enough death to last several lifetimes." Something in his tone made Abigail look more closely at him. Beyond the weathered features and the scar on his face, she saw a weariness that went deeper than physical exhaustion, the look of a man who carried invisible burdens. "You're running from something," she observed, her illness perhaps making her more direct than propriety would normally allow. A faint, humorless smile touched Nathaniel's lips. "Aren't we all, in one way or another?" he replied, effectively closing the subject. "You should try to eat something, just a few bites of softened hardtack to start." As he moved away to prepare the simple food, Abigail watched him, realizing that whatever secrets this man carried might very well determine both their fates in the days to come. But for now, his presence meant survival, and that would have to be enough. Dawn broke over the abandoned stagecoach station, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Nathaniel had spent much of the night keeping watch over Abigail, whose fever had spiked dangerously in the darkness. He'd bathed her forehead with cool water and administered small doses of laudanum when her discomfort seemed unbearable. Now, as the first light filtered through the grimy window, he saw that her color looked marginally better. Nathaniel moved quietly to the door and stepped outside, inhaling the relatively cool morning air before the day's heat set in. He checked on dust in the small corral, then surveyed their surroundings with the habitual wariness of a man accustomed to being hunted. The station sat in a shallow depression, with scattered junipers and sagebrush dotting the landscape. To the west, low hills provided some protection from observation, while the eastern approach lay open, the trail visible for nearly a mile. It was a defensible position, at least. He'd chosen worse places to hole up, but they couldn't stay indefinitely. Abigail needed proper care beyond what he could provide with his limited supplies, and he needed to keep moving before word spread of a lone gunman helping a sick woman at the abandoned Copper Creek station. Inside, Abigail stirred as a ray of sunlight fell across her face. Her eyes opened slowly, focusing with difficulty on her surroundings. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was or how she'd come to be there. Then the memories flooded back. Daniel's death, her own illness, the stagecoach driver abandoning her, and the arrival of the mysterious Nathaniel Hayes. She attempted to sit up, but found even that small movement exhausting. Her throat felt marginally better than yesterday, though still painfully raw, and the crushing headache had receded to a dull, persistent throb. Progress, however slight. The door opened, and Nathaniel entered carrying a small bundle of what appeared to be fresh plants. He nodded when he saw she was awake. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter," he said, his deep voice carrying across the small room. "You look a shade better than yesterday." "I feel it," Abigail replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Though that isn't saying much." A faint smile touched Nathaniel's lips, perhaps the first genuine one she'd seen from him. "Humor's a good sign, means you're fighting." He moved to the small table he'd cleared yesterday and placed the plants on it. "Found some wild mint and dandelion greens, good for fever and to settle your stomach. I'll make tea." Abigail watched as he worked with practiced efficiency, using a tin cup and his hunting knife to prepare the herbs. His movements were precise and economical, nothing wasted, nothing excessive. The habits of a man who had survived by his wits in harsh conditions. "You seem knowledgeable about healing," she observed. Nathaniel shrugged slightly without turning around. "War teaches many skills. I was a scout for the Union. When half your unit comes down with camp fever, you learn quick or you die." This casual mention of his past gave Abigail something to focus on beyond her own misery. "You fought in the war between the states." 3 years. 16th Pennsylvania Cavalry. His tone was matter-of-fact, revealing neither pride nor regret. "Long time ago now, 20 years, Abigail calculated. If he'd been in the cavalry, he would have been very young when he enlisted, perhaps just a boy, like so many who had fought in that terrible conflict. "My father was with the Massachusetts Volunteers," she offered. "He never spoke of it, but I know he was at Gettysburg." Nathaniel nodded, his back still to her as he worked. "Most who survive don't speak of it. Some things are better left buried." Something in his tone suggested he wasn't just talking about the war. He turned, holding the cup of steeped herbs. "This will be bitter, but it'll help. Small sips." Abigail struggled to sit up, and Nathaniel moved quickly to assist her, one strong arm supporting her back while he held the cup to her lips with his other hand. The tea was indeed bitter, but beneath the medicinal taste she detected a hint of mint that made it just palatable. "Thank you," she murmured when she'd managed a few sips. Nathaniel helped her lie back down, then returned to his place by the table. "I need to hunt today," he announced. "We need fresh meat if you're to regain your strength, and my supplies are running low." Alarm flashed through Abigail at the thought of being left alone again. "How long will you be gone?" "A few hours at most. The hills to the west should have pronghorn or at least rabbits." He must have noted her anxiety, for he added, "I'll leave you the derringer and plenty of water within reach. The fever seems to be breaking, but you need to rest." Abigail nodded, fighting to control her fear. This man owed her nothing. She had no right to demand he stay. Besides, he was correct. They needed food, and she was in no condition to help acquire it. "I understand," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Please be careful." A curious expression crossed Nathaniel's face, surprise, perhaps, that she would concern herself with his safety when her own was so precarious. But he simply nodded and began checking his rifle and ammunition. Before departing, he filled the water barrel from the well and placed a full cup within her reach, along with the derringer and some hardtack soaked in water to make it edible. He hesitated at the door, looking back at her with an unreadable expression. "I will return, Mrs. Carter," he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "You have my word." With that, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Left alone, Abigail drifted between sleep and wakefulness, her thoughts wandering through fevered dreams and fragmented memories. She saw Daniel as he'd been when they first met at her father's bookshop in Boston, handsome and ambitious, full of plans for their future in the West. She recalled their wedding day just 6 months ago, her sister Julia's tearful farewell at the train station, the long journey that had brought them to Wyoming territory with such high hopes, and she remembered Daniel's final days, his strong body wasted by fever, his delirious mumblings, and finally, the terrible stillness of death. The grief she'd suppressed in the desperate struggle for her own survival welled up now, and she wept quietly, tears sliding down her temples to dampen the makeshift pillow beneath her head. She must have fallen into a deeper sleep afterward, for when she next opened her eyes, the light had shifted, suggesting several hours had passed. The station was quiet, with no sign of Nathaniel's return. Abigail felt a flicker of unease. Had he abandoned her, as the stagecoach driver had done? No, she decided. Whatever else Nathaniel Hayes might be, he was a man of his word. He would return if he was able, but what if he wasn't able? The thought brought a fresh wave of anxiety. What if he'd been injured while hunting or, worse, encountered whoever he was running from? She was certain now that he was a fugitive of some kind. The careful way he scanned the horizon, his reluctance to speak of his past, the weapons he handled with such practiced ease, all suggested a man accustomed to being pursued. Yet he had risked his safety to help her, a stranger. That spoke to a character at odds with what one might expect of a wanted man. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted her thoughts. Abigail reached for the derringer, her heart pounding as she strained to listen. A single horse, moving, at a walk. Likely Nathaniel, but caution had become second nature in her precarious situation. The hoofbeats stopped outside, followed by the familiar sound of Nathaniel's spurs as he dismounted. The door opened, and he entered, carrying what appeared to be a field-dressed rabbit. Relief washed over Abigail, so powerful that she had to close her eyes for a moment to compose herself. "You're back," she said simply, when she could trust her voice again. Nathaniel hung his hat on a peg by the door, revealing dark hair streaked with premature silver at the temples. His expression was as guarded as ever, but something in his eyes suggested he understood the depth of her relief. "I said I would be," he replied, moving to the small stove in the corner of the station. "Found a rabbit warren in the hills. Not as much meat as I'd hoped, but it'll make a decent stew with the dried beans from my pack." He worked silently for a time, preparing the rabbit and setting a pot of water to boil on the stove. Abigail watched him, noting the efficiency of his movements and the subtle vigilance that never seemed to leave him, even in this mundane task. Every few minutes his eyes would lift to the window, checking the trail outside. "Who are you running from, Mr. Hayes?" she asked finally, her weakness perhaps making her bolder than she might otherwise have been. Nathaniel's hands stilled for a fraction of a second before resuming their work. "What makes you think I'm running from anyone?" "Everything about you," Abigail replied honestly. "The way you watched the trail, how you positioned your bedroll to face both the door and the window, the weapons you never leave out of reach." For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, without looking at her, he spoke. "There's a poster with my face on it in most towns from Denver to Salt Lake City," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. $500 for the apprehension of Nathaniel Hayes, wanted for the murder of William Breckenridge, foreman of the Silver Dollar Mine. He turned to face her now, his pale blue eyes meeting hers directly. "I didn't murder him, but that hardly matters when the dead man is a cousin to the governor of Colorado, and the only witnesses were Mexican miners who know better than to contradict the official story." Abigail considered this. A wanted man, accused of murder. By all rights, she should be terrified. And yet, her instincts told her there was more to the story. "Why did you kill him then, if not murder?" she asked quietly. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "I worked security for the mine. Breckenridge was skimming from the Mexican workers' pay, claiming deductions for equipment they never received. When I questioned it, he drew on me. I was faster." He shrugged, a small gesture that somehow conveyed both regret and resignation. "Self-defense doesn't count for much when you've got no one to back your claim." He turned back to the stove, clearly considering the subject closed. Abigail didn't press further, but she found herself believing him. Perhaps it was foolish to trust the word of a stranger with a price on his head, but something in his manner rang true. "Thank you for telling me," she said after a while, "and for coming back." Nathaniel gave her a sharp look, as if surprised by her calm acceptance of his situation. "You're not afraid, knowing what I just told you?" Abigail managed a weak smile. "Mr. Hayes, I was dying alone in an abandoned station with typhoid fever before you arrived, between certain death and the company of a man wanted for a killing he says was justified. Well, it's hardly a difficult choice." A humorless chuckle escaped him. "When you put it that way." He returned to preparing their meal, adding beans and some dried herbs to the pot. The savory aroma gradually filled the small space, making Abigail realize how long it had been since she'd eaten properly. Her stomach growled audibly, prompting another of Nathaniel's rare smiles. "Appetite returning is a good sign," he observed. "Though you should start with just the broth. Too much solid food too soon will make you sick again." As the stew simmered, Nathaniel checked her forehead for fever. His hand was rough with calluses, but surprisingly gentle against her skin. "Much cooler," he pronounced. "The worst has passed, I think. Another day or two of rest, and you should be strong enough to travel." Abigail nodded, though the thought of travel raised questions she'd been too ill to consider until now. Where would she go? Her plans had died with Daniel. They'd spent nearly everything they had on the journey west and the plot of land in Silver Creek. The small amount of money she still carried would barely cover stagecoach fare, let alone allow her to establish herself somewhere new. "What will you do once I'm well enough to travel?" she asked, partly to distract herself from these worrisome thoughts. Nathaniel was silent for a long moment. "Continue north," he finally said. "There's work in the Montana Territory for a man who doesn't ask too many questions and doesn't mind being alone." "Ranch work?" he nodded. "For now. Eventually, I'll need to clear my name or move somewhere the Colorado authorities can't reach. But that's a concern for another day." Abigail considered this. A life constantly looking over one's shoulder sounded exhausting and lonely. She wondered how long he'd been living this way, and what he'd left behind when he became a fugitive. "Do you have family somewhere?" she asked. A shadow passed over Nathaniel's features. "Not anymore," he replied shortly. Then, perhaps feeling he'd been too abrupt, he added, "My wife and unborn child died 5 years ago. Complication during childbirth." "I'm so sorry," Abigail said softly, understanding now the depth of sorrow she occasionally glimpsed in his eyes. "What was her name?" "Sarah." The single word carried a wealth of emotion. "She was a school teacher in a mining town where I worked security. We had less than a year together before—" He trailed off, then visibly gathered himself. "But that's ancient history now." His tone suggested the subject was closed, but Abigail found herself wanting to know more about this complex man who had saved her life. He'd shown her kindness when he had every reason to remain uninvolved, risking his freedom to help a stranger. There was a fundamental decency in him that contradicted what one might expect of a fugitive. The stew was ready, and Nathaniel ladled a small portion of broth into a cup for her, helping her sit up to drink it. The rich flavor was the most wonderful thing Abigail had tasted in days, and she had to restrain herself from gulping it down too quickly. Slowly, Nathaniel cautioned. Your stomach needs time to remember its purpose. They ate in companionable silence, Nathaniel taking a full bowl for himself, while ensuring Abigail didn't overindulge. As the evening deepened around them, Abigail found herself more alert than she'd been since falling ill, the food and rest beginning to restore her strength. "Would you tell me about Silver Creek?" Nathaniel asked unexpectedly as he cleaned their utensils. "What brought you and your husband all the way from Boston?" Grateful for the chance to speak of normal things, Abigail described the plans she and Daniel had made, the hotel and restaurant they'd intended to build near the new railroad junction, catering to travelers and the growing population of the town. "Daniel had experience in his family's shipping business, and I had worked in my father's bookstore since I was a girl," she explained. "We thought our combined skills would serve us well in a frontier town, hungry for civilization's comforts." "Sounds like a solid plan," Nathaniel observed. "Silver Creek is growing fast. A decent hotel would do well there." "You know the town?" He nodded. "Passed through about 2 months ago before the typhoid outbreak. The railroad has brought in all sorts of folk, merchants, laborers, families looking to settle. Place was bursting at the seams, with most newcomers sleeping in tents or crowded boarding houses. This confirmation that their business plan had been sound brought Abigail both satisfaction and a fresh wave of grief. They had been right about the opportunity, but fate had intervened brutally. "The land is still mine," she said, thinking aloud. "The deed is in my bag. But without Daniel and with our savings nearly gone, I don't see how I could possibly proceed alone." Nathaniel considered this. "Land near a growing railroad town has value," he pointed out. "You could sell it, use the money to return east, or establish yourself elsewhere." The practical suggestion made sense, but the thought of returning to Boston as a widow, dependent on her sister's charity, filled Abigail with a strange resistance. She had left that life behind, had embraced the vision of a new beginning in the West. To crawl back, defeated by tragedy, seemed unbearable. "I don't want to go back," she said with unexpected vehemence. "There's nothing for me there but pity and a life of genteel dependence." Nathaniel raised an eyebrow at her tone, but nodded as if he understood perfectly. "The West gets in your blood," he said simply. "Hard to settle for less once you've tasted the freedom of it." "Yes," Abigail agreed, surprised by his understanding. "Exactly that." Outside, the sun had set and darkness pressed against the windows of the station. Nathaniel rose and checked that the door was securely barred before adding wood to the stove for the night. "You should rest," he told her. "Tomorrow, if you're stronger, we can discuss your options for when we leave here." Abigail nodded, suddenly, exhausted despite having done nothing more strenuous than sit up and eat a little soup. She settled back onto her makeshift bed as Nathaniel extinguished all but one small lamp. "Mr. Hayes," she said, as he moved to his bedroll by the door. "Thank you, not just for the care, but for speaking to me as a person with choices, not just a helpless woman to be pitied." In the dim light, she saw something flicker across his face, surprise, perhaps, or a recognition of something familiar in her attitude. "Get some sleep, Mrs. Carter," he replied, his voice gentler than she'd heard it before. "Tomorrow is soon, enough to face the world's challenges, As Abigail drifted towards sleep, one thought crystallized with surprising clarity. Whatever path she chose going forward, she did not want to face it alone. And for reasons she wasn't yet ready to examine closely, she found herself hoping that Nathaniel Hayes might remain part of her journey, at least for a little while longer. Morning arrived with a gentle rain tapping against the station's tin roof. Abigail woke feeling remarkably better, weak still, but with a clarity of mind that had been absent for days. The oppressive fever had broken during the night, leaving her wrung out but lucid. She lay quietly for a moment, listening to the rain and taking inventory of her condition. Her throat still hurt when she swallowed, but the crushing headache was gone. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, a welcome change from the nausea that had plagued her since falling ill. Turning her head, she saw Nathaniel seated by the window, a small notebook open in his hands. He was writing with a pencil stub, his expression unusually unguarded in what he believed was a private moment. Without his customary wariness, his features appeared younger, the hard lines of vigilance softened by concentration. Sensing her gaze, he looked up, the shuttered expression returning almost instantly. "You're awake," he observed, closing the notebook and tucking it into his shirt pocket. "How do you feel?" "Better," Abigail replied, her voice stronger than it had been the previous day. "Human again, if barely." Nathaniel crossed to her and checked her forehead with the back of his hand. "No fever." "Good. Think you could manage to sit up for a proper meal?" "I'd like to try," Abigail said, already pushing herself to a sitting position. The world swam briefly, but steadied. Progress. Nathaniel helped arrange her blankets to support her back against the wall, then moved to the stove where a pot simmered. "Oatmeal," he explained. "Not fancy, but it'll be gentle on your stomach." As he prepared a bowl for her, Abigail found herself studying him with new interest. "Were you writing in a journal?" she asked, curiosity overcoming propriety. His shoulders tensed slightly, but he answered without turning. "Letters mostly, never sent." "To your family?" A pause. "To Sarah?" "Old habit I never broke." The admission, surprisingly personal from this guarded man, touched Abigail deeply. She could picture him in lonely camps across the West, writing to a wife 5 years dead, preserving a connection to the life he'd lost. "I understand," she said softly. "I've been having conversations with Daniel in my head since he died. Telling him about my day, asking for his advice." Nathaniel turned, 2 bowls of oatmeal in his hands. "Grief makes ghosts of us all," he said, his tone neither judgmental nor pitying, just matter of fact, as if stating a truth long familiar to him. He handed her a bowl and spoon, then settled on his bedroll with his own breakfast. They ate in the companionable silence for a time, the rain providing a soothing backdrop to their thoughts. "I should change your bandages," Nathaniel said when they'd finished eating. At Abigail's confused look, he clarified, "Your hands. They're blistered from the fever." Abigail looked down at her hands in surprise. She hadn't even noticed the strips of clean cloth wrapped around her palms. "You bandaged my hands?" "Yesterday while you slept," Nathaniel explained. "Camp fever often causes blisters on the palms and soles. Figured typhoid might do the same." She examined the neat bandaging, touched by the care it represented. Such attention to her comfort went beyond mere duty. Nathaniel rummaged in his pack and produced a small tin of salve and fresh strips of cloth. He knelt beside her and carefully unwrapped the bandages. Beneath, her palms were indeed blistered, though the angry redness had faded since yesterday. "These are healing well," he pronounced, applying the salve with gentle fingers. The ointment smelled of pine and something medicinal. "Should be completely healed in a few days." As he worked, Abigail studied his face, noting details she'd been too ill to register before. The network of fine lines at the corners of his eyes, suggesting a man who'd once smiled more frequently. The careful precision of his movements, the way he'd positioned himself to maintain a clear view of both the door and window, even while tending to her hands. "Tell me about the war," she said impulsively, wanting to know more about the experiences that had shaped him. "If you don't mind speaking of it." Nathaniel's hands stilled momentarily before resuming their work. "What would you like to know?" "Anything you're willing to share. My father never spoke of his service, not once. It was as if those years simply didn't exist." He finished wrapping her right hand before answering. "Many don't speak of it, can't find the words or don't want to burden others with what they saw." He began on her left hand, his touch clinical but not impersonal. "I was 16 when I enlisted, lied about my age, of course. My father had been killed at Antietam, and I was determined to avenge him." "So young," Abigail murmured. Nathaniel shrugged. "Many were younger. Boys who should have been in school learned to kill instead." His voice remained even, but she sensed the effort it cost him. "I was assigned to the cavalry as a scout because I could ride and shoot better than most. Spent 3 years ranging ahead of the main forces, mapping terrain, tracking rebel movements, sometimes engaging in skirmishes." "Were you ever wounded?" Abigail asked. "Twice. Bullet through the shoulder at Petersburg, saber cut on the thigh during a cavalry charge at Yellow Tavern." He secured the bandage on her left hand and sat back. "Nothing compared to what others suffered. And after the war. What then?" Nathaniel gathered the old bandages and tucked the salve back into his pack. "Drifted west like many veterans, worked cattle drives in Texas, broke horses in Arizona Territory, did some prospecting in Colorado." He paused. "Eventually found steadier work as security for mining companies, protecting shipments and maintaining order. That's how I met Sarah in a Colorado mining town where she'd come to teach." The way he spoke her name, with a softness that belied his rugged exterior, told Abigail volumes about what Sarah had meant to him. "She sounds special," Abigail said gently. She was. 2 simple words that contained an ocean of feeling. Too good for the likes of me, but she couldn't be convinced of that. Abigail smiled at this rare glimpse of self-deprecating humor. "I suspect she saw the man beneath the scout's exterior." Nathaniel met her eyes briefly, something unreadable flickering in his gaze. "Perhaps." He stood abruptly, ending the conversation. "You should rest while I check the perimeter. The rain will have washed away tracks, but it's best to remain cautious." He donned his hat and slicker, then paused at the door. "We'll need to discuss our next steps when I return. You're recovering well, but we can't stay here indefinitely." With that, he was gone, leaving Abigail to contemplate their uncertain future. She used his absence to assess her own condition more thoroughly. With careful movements, she managed to stand, steadying herself against the wall as dizziness washed over her. After a moment, it passed, and she took a tentative step, then another. Her legs felt like rubber, but they supported her weight. By the time Nathaniel returned, she had managed to walk the length of the small station twice and was seated on an upturned crate near the stove, combing her tangled hair with her fingers. Surprise registered briefly on his face. "You're up?" "Barely," Abigail admitted. "But it's progress." He hung his wet slicker by the door. "No sign of anyone nearby. Rain's letting up, though." She nodded, continuing to work the tangles from her hair. After a moment of hesitation, Nathaniel reached into his pack and produced a horn comb, offering it without comment. Abigail accepted it gratefully, wondering about the story behind this unexpected item among his possessions. Reading her curiosity, he explained, "It was Sarah's, one of the few things I kept. The simple statement and the trust it implied moved her deeply. Thank you. I'll be careful with it." As she worked the comb through her hair, Nathaniel busied himself checking their supplies. "We have enough food for 2 more days," he reported. "Water's plentiful, but ammunition is running low. I'd rather not hunt again unless necessary." Gunshots carry too far in this country. Abigail considered their situation. How far is Blackwater from here? 15 miles northeast. A day's ride for a healthy person, longer for someone recovering from typhoid. He gave her an assessing look. You're improving rapidly, but not that rapidly. And Silver Creek? About 30 miles southwest. Too far in your condition. Abigail nodded, accepting his assessment. What about your plans to head north? Montana Territory, you said. Nathaniel leaned against the table, arms crossed. That hasn't changed, but I won't leave you stranded. What do you propose then? He seemed to choose his words carefully. I could take you to Blackwater once you're strong enough to travel. You could catch the eastbound stage there, either to return to Boston or to another destination of your choice. The prospect of separation shouldn't have troubled her as much as it did. After all, they were strangers brought together by circumstance, not choice. Yet the thought of continuing alone filled her with unexpected dread. "And what about you?" she asked. "Wouldn't entering a town be dangerous with a price on your head?" "I wouldn't enter Blackwater itself. I'd get you to the outskirts, ensure you reach the stage office safely, then continue north." The plan was logical, practical, and utterly unsatisfying. Abigail found herself reluctant to accept such a neat severance of their connection. "There's another option," she said slowly, an idea forming as she spoke. "You mentioned that land near. A railroad town has value. I could sell my property in Silver Creek, but I'd need to go there personally to complete the transaction." Nathaniel frowned. "As I said, Silver Creek is 30 miles away. Too far in your condition." "Not immediately," Abigail conceded. "But in a few days, with rest and proper food, I should be strong enough for the journey." She met his gaze directly. "And Silver Creek is on your way north. You could accompany me there, help me sell the property, and then continue on your journey." He studied her thoughtfully. "That would delay my departure by at least a week. You're recovering well, but you'll need more time before you can travel. Such a distance." "I understand," Abigail said, trying to keep disappointment from her voice. "It was just a thought." Nathaniel was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "It's not without merit," he finally said. "Silver Creek is large enough that I could avoid attention while you handle your business. And the delay, while not ideal, isn't impossible." Hope flickered in Abigail's chest. "Then you'll consider it?" "I'm considering it," he confirmed, though his tone remained guarded. "But I'd need to be clear about something, Mrs. Carter. I can get you to Silver Creek safely, but I can't stay. My presence would eventually put you at risk." "I understand," Abigail assured him, though the prospect of parting ways in Silver Creek felt almost as troubling as parting in Blackwater. She was growing attached to this stoic, complicated man, a realization that both surprised and unsettled her. "Let's take it one day at a time," Nathaniel suggested, seemingly uncomfortable with planning too far ahead. "See how your recovery progresses." Abigail nodded, accepting this compromise. "Fair enough." Outside, the rain had stopped, and a patch of blue sky was visible through the station's grimy window. Nathaniel moved to check the condition of the trail, and Abigail used his absence to reflect on her growing feelings. Was she simply experiencing gratitude toward the man who had saved her life? Or was there something more developing, a connection, forged in the crucible of shared hardship? And if the latter, what could possibly come of it? He was a wanted man with a price on his head, and she was a widow with an uncertain future. She was still pondering these questions when Nathaniel returned, bringing an armful of dried wood from the station's depleted stockpile. "Trails drying, and quickly," he reported. "Another day of sunshine, and it should be passable for gentle travel. Not that you're ready for that yet," he added, giving her an assessing look. "I'm feeling stronger by the hour," Abigail assured him, though she knew she was exaggerating somewhat. Perhaps tomorrow I could try walking outside. Fresh air would do me good. Nathaniel considered this. If the weather holds and you continue to improve, a short walk might be manageable. He set the wood beside the stove. For now, though, I think you should lie down. You're pale again. Abigail wanted to protest, but realized he was right. The exertion of combing her hair and their conversation had drained what little energy she'd recovered. With Nathaniel's assistance, she returned to her makeshift bed, frustrated by her body's weakness, but accepting its limitations. For now. As the day progressed, they fell into a comfortable routine. Nathaniel prepared a simple lunch of dried beef and hardtack softened in broth, which Abigail managed to eat with growing appetite. He told her stories of his travels through the territories, carefully edited, she suspected, to emphasize natural wonders and colorful characters rather than the darker aspects of his fugitive existence. In return, she shared tales of her life. In Boston, her father's bookstore, where she'd worked since her mother's death when she was 12, her sister Julia's marriage to a prominent banker, her meeting with Daniel when he came to the store seeking books on frontier development. He was so full of plans, she recalled, a wistful smile touching her lips. He'd worked in his family's shipping business, but chafed under his father's control. The West represented freedom to him, a chance to build something that was entirely his own. A common dream, Nathaniel observed. What was uncommon was finding a woman willing to share the hardships such a dream entailed. Abigail considered this. I don't think I truly understood what those hardships would be, she admitted, but I was ready for change. After my mother died, I became the woman of the house at 12, caring for my father and younger sister, helping in the store. When Julia married, I was left alone with father, facing a future as a spinster bookkeeper. She smiled ruefully. Daniel's vision of the West made my life sound like a prison by comparison, so when he proposed after just 3 months of courtship, I accepted without hesitation. No regrets? Nathaniel asked, his tone neutral. Abigail thought carefully before answering. Regrets about marrying Daniel? No. He was a good man with an honorable dream. Regrets about leaving Boston so hastily, with so little preparation for frontier life. Perhaps. She sighed. If I'd known more, perhaps I could have saved him when he fell ill. Typhoid is a killer, Nathaniel said firmly. Even army doctors with years of experience lose patience to it. You couldn't have saved him. His certainty was oddly comforting. Thank you for that, she said softly. As evening approached, Nathaniel prepared another rabbit stew, supplemented with wild onions he'd gathered during his perimeter check. The savory aroma filled the small station, making Abigail realize how much her appetite had returned. She insisted on sitting up for the meal, and Nathaniel helped her to the upturned crate by the stove. The warm food and the simple pleasure of eating at a table, however makeshift, lifted her spirits considerably. Tell me about Montana, she said as they ate. Why there, specifically? Nathaniel considered the question. Space, he finally said. Room to breathe without constantly looking over my shoulder. The territory's vast, with fewer lawmen than most places. A man can disappear into the mountains if necessary. Sounds lonely, Abigail observed. He shrugged. I'm accustomed to solitude. But is that truly what you want? A life alone in the wilderness? The question seemed to catch him off guard. He set down his spoon, his expression thoughtful. Want and need are different things, Mrs. Carter. What I want stopped mattering when Sarah died, and that poster with my face on it started circulating. Abigail, she said impulsively. Please, call me Abigail. After all we've shared, Mrs. Carter seems unnecessarily formal. Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, his pale blue eyes unreadable. Abigail, he finally conceded, her name sounding different in his deep voice. And to answer your question more directly, no, solitude isn't what I would choose if circumstances were different. But circumstances aren't different. The note of finality in his tone discouraged further questions on the subject. They finished their meal in comfortable silence, and Nathaniel helped Abigail back to her bed as night fell. He banked the fire for the evening. Abigail found herself watching the play of light and shadow across his features. In just a few days, this man had gone from being a mysterious stranger to someone she trusted with her life, someone whose company she'd come to value more than she'd expected. "Nathaniel," she said softly as he prepared to extinguish the lamp. "Thank you, not just for saving my life, but for treating me as a person worth saving." He stood very still for a moment, his expression hidden in shadow. "Good night, Abigail," he finally replied, his voice unusually gentle. "Rest well. Tomorrow will bring enough decisions for both of us." As darkness enveloped the station, Abigail drifted towards sleep with a growing certainty that whatever path lay ahead, she wanted Nathaniel Hayes to walk it with her, at least for a little while longer. The practicality of such a wish was another matter entirely, but for now, in the quiet darkness, pragmatism could wait. The following morning dawned clear and warm, with no trace of yesterday's rain except for the lingering freshness in the air. Abigail woke to the aroma of coffee brewing on the stove, a luxury she hadn't enjoyed since falling ill. She sat up carefully, pleased to find that the dizziness had largely subsided. Her body still felt weak, but her mind was clear, and her determination stronger than ever. Today, she would push her recovery further. Nathaniel glanced over from the stove, a hint of approval in his expression when he saw her sitting up without assistance. "Morning," he greeted, pouring steaming coffee into a tin cup. "Thought you might be ready for something stronger than herbal tea." "You thought correctly," Abigail replied with genuine enthusiasm. "I've missed coffee desperately." He brought the cup to her, along with a small piece of hardtack. "Small sips," he cautioned. "It's strong." The coffee was indeed potent, but the familiar bitterness was like greeting an old friend. Abigail savored it slowly, feeling more human with each sip. "I'd like to try walking outside today," she announced. "After finishing half the cup, the fresh air would do me good, and I need to rebuild my strength if we're to travel soon." Nathaniel considered this, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. "The weather's favorable," he conceded. "A short walk might be possible. We'll see how you do standing and walking inside first." His caution was reasonable. Abigail had to admit. She finished her coffee and, with Nathaniel's steadying hand at her elbow, rose to her feet. The weakness in her legs was pronounced but manageable. She took several steps across the station floor, concentrating on maintaining her balance. "How does it feel?" Nathaniel asked, watching her movements with a clinical eye. "Like I'm walking on a rolling ship deck," Abigail admitted with a rueful smile. "But I won't fall." They practiced inside for nearly half an hour, Nathaniel gradually reducing his support until Abigail could cross the small station unassisted. Her legs trembled with exertion, but determination pushed her forward. If they were to leave for Silver Creek in the next few days, she needed to regain her strength rapidly. "Enough for now," Nathaniel finally declared, noting her increasing fatigue. "Rest for an hour, then we'll try outside if you're up to it." Abigail wanted to protest, but recognized the wisdom in his words. She returned to her bed, frustrated by her body's limitations, but encouraged by the progress she'd made. While she rested, Nathaniel prepared for their potential departure, checking their supplies and his weapons with methodical precision. Watching him through half-closed eyes, Abigail was struck again by the contradiction he embodied. A wanted man with a gentle touch, a loner who'd risked his freedom to save a stranger. The hour passed quickly, and true to his word, Nathaniel helped her prepare for a short venture outside. He brought her shawl, which he'd apparently cleaned and dried during her illness. "It may be warm in the sun, but you'll need this in the shade," he said, draping it around her shoulders. "And a hat would be wise. The sun can be brutal on those." Recovering from fever, he offered her his spare bandana, which she tied over her hair with grateful acceptance of his concern. Thus prepared, with Nathaniel's steady hand at her elbow, Abigail stepped outside the stagecoach station for the first time in days. The impact of fresh air and open space after the confines of the station was overwhelming. Abigail closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply of the sage-scented breeze. When she opened them again, the vast Wyoming landscape spread before her, rolling plains dotted with sagebrush and distant hills rising blue against the horizon. "It's beautiful," she murmured, the word inadequate for the majesty before her. Nathaniel nodded, his expression softening as he surveyed the vista. "This country gets under your skin. For all its hardships, there's nothing like it." They walked slowly along the packed earth in front of the station, Abigail leaning on Nathaniel's arm more heavily than she would have liked. Each step was an effort, but each also represented a victory over the illness that had nearly claimed her life. "Tell me about Silver Creek," she requested, partly to distract herself from her physical struggle. "You mentioned passing through before the typhoid outbreak. What's it like?" Nathaniel guided her toward a flat boulder positioned conveniently at the edge of the station's small yard, likely used by travelers waiting for stagecoaches in the station's active days. He helped her sit, then settled beside her, maintaining a respectable distance while staying close enough to assist if needed. "It's growing fast," he began, gazing toward the southwest as if he could see the town from here. "The railroad junction brings trade and travelers from 3 directions. There's a main street with the usual businesses, general store, 2 saloons, a small hotel that's more boarding house than proper accommodation, blacksmith, livery." He paused, considering. "The town has potential. It's positioned well for commerce, and the surrounding land is decent for cattle. The people seemed enterprising, a mix of long-time settlers and newcomers looking to capitalize on the railroad. Your husband chose wisely for a business venture." The casual compliment to Daniel's judgment warmed Abigail. "Our plot is near the junction itself," she said. "Daniel said location would be everything for a hotel business." He wasn't wrong, Nathaniel agreed, though with the typhoid outbreak, things may have changed. Towns can empty quickly when disease strikes. The sobering observation gave Abigail pause. "Do you think it will recover?" "Most likely, the railroad ensures that. But it might take time for people to trust the water supply again." He glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "If you're still considering selling your land, that might affect the price you can command." Abigail nodded, appreciating his frankness. "I'll need to assess the situation when we arrive," she said, the "we" slipping out naturally, although they'd made no firm plans. If Nathaniel noticed, he gave no indication. "A sensible approach," he agreed, rising to his feet. "We should head back now. You've done well for a first outing, but it's best not to overexert yourself." The return journey to the station seemed twice as long, Abigail's legs trembling with fatigue by the time they reached the door. She was grateful for Nathaniel's solid support and tried not to lean too heavily against him, though her pride was rapidly giving way to physical necessity. Inside, he helped her to her bed, where she sank down with undisguised relief. "Frustrating," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "To be so weak when there's so much to be done." "Recovery takes time," Nathaniel reminded her, his voice gentler than usual. "You're doing remarkably well for someone who was at death's door 3 days ago." The reminder put her impatience in perspective. "You're right, of course. She broke off, uncertain how to express the urgency she felt without sounding ungrateful for his caution. "You want to move forward?" Nathaniel completed her thought, "to take control of your future rather than remaining at the mercy of circumstances." "Yes," Abigail agreed, struck by his insight. "Exactly that." He nodded, understanding in his pale blue eyes. "Rest for now. We'll walk again this afternoon, and a bit further tomorrow if all goes well. By the day after, if your progress continues, We might consider a short ride to test your endurance for travel. The methodical plan reassured her. Nathaniel wasn't dismissing her desire to move on. He was ensuring she could do so safely. True to his word, they ventured outside again that afternoon, and twice the following day, each excursion extending a bit further than the last. By the third day after her fever broke, Abigail could walk the entire perimeter of the station yard unassisted, though not without fatigue. That evening, as they shared a meal of the last rabbit stew, supplemented with wild greens Nathaniel had gathered, he broached the subject they'd been circling. "Our supplies are running low," he observed, his tone neutral. "We'll need to make decisions soon. You're recovering well, but traveling to Silver Creek will still tax your strength considerably." Abigail met his gaze across the small table they'd improvised from crates. "I'm ready to try," she said firmly, "or I will be by tomorrow. What about you? Have you decided whether to accompany me to Silver Creek?" Nathaniel was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "I've considered it," he finally said. "It's not without risk for me, but leaving you to travel alone would be unacceptable." The admission, delivered in his characteristically understated manner, warmed Abigail more than she cared to admit. "Thank you," she said simply. "I value your company more than I can express." A flicker of something crossed his face. Surprise, perhaps, or an emotion she couldn't quite name. "We'll leave tomorrow at first light, then," he decided. "It's a 2-day journey at the pace you'll be able to maintain. We'll need to camp one night on the trail." Abigail nodded, simultaneously relieved at having a definite plan and apprehensive about the journey ahead. "I'll be ready." The remainder of the evening was spent in preparations. Nathaniel checked and cleaned his weapons, repacked their meager supplies, and gave Abigail careful instructions on what to expect during the journey. She, in turn, did her best to organize her few possessions and prepare mentally for the physical challenge ahead. As night fell, an unexpected melancholy settled over Abigail. The abandoned stagecoach station had been a place of desperate illness and fear, yet also of recovery and growing connection. Leaving it felt strangely like closing, a chapter in her life, one that, despite its hardships, had brought her Nathaniel's steadfast presence. "Something troubling you?" he asked, noticing her pensive mood as he banked the fire for the night. Abigail smiled wryly. "Just reflecting on how strangely attached one can become to a place, even one associated with hardship. This station saved my life, or rather you did, within these walls." Nathaniel considered this. "Places hold power," he agreed. "They become markers in our lives, for good or ill." "Do you have such places?" she asked, genuinely curious about what landmarks might define his wanderer's existence. He was quiet for so long that Abigail thought he might not answer. Then, his voice low in the dimming light, he said, "A cliff overlooking a valley in Colorado, where I buried Sarah and our child. A battlefield in Virginia, where I saw half my unit die in a single afternoon. A canyon in Arizona, where I lived alone for a winter, healing from wounds both visible and hidden." The simple list, delivered without embellishment, painted a portrait of a life marked by loss and solitary endurance. Abigail's heart ached for the man before her, who had known so much hardship, yet still retained the capacity for kindness. "And now this place," she said softly, "where you saved a stranger's life, at risk to your own." Nathaniel looked up, meeting her gaze directly. "I didn't think of it that way," he admitted. "But yes, perhaps this station will be another marker in my path." With that thought hanging between them, they retired for the night, their last inn, the refuge that had brought them together. Dawn arrived with a faint mist clinging to the sagebrush surrounding the station. They ate a simple breakfast of the last hardtack and coffee, then prepared to depart, Nathaniel saddled Dust with practiced efficiency, attaching their supplies and arranging a makeshift pillion for Abigail behind the saddle. "You'll ride behind me," he explained. "It's not ideal for long travel, but Dust can carry us both for the distances we'll cover each day. If you tire or feel faint, tell me immediately. We can stop as often as needed." Abigail nodded, determined not to be a burden, despite her lingering weakness. She donned her freshly cleaned dress, now sadly wrinkled but better than wearing it soiled, and tied her hair back with the bandana Nathaniel had lent her. Her appearance was far from the proper Boston lady she'd once been, but propriety seemed a distant concern compared to survival. With a final look around the station that had sheltered them, they stepped outside into the cool morning air. Nathaniel helped Abigail mount behind him, his hands strong and steady as he lifted her to Dust's back. "Hold on to my waist," he instructed, passing her the reins momentarily as he mounted in front of her. "Don't worry about propriety out here. Staying on the horse is more important than maintaining decorum." Abigail placed her hands gingerly around his waist, acutely aware of the impropriety of their position, yet recognizing its necessity. As Nathaniel urged Dust forward, the motion of the horse pressed her closer to his back, and she tightened her grip instinctively. They traveled steadily through the morning, Nathaniel setting a gentle pace out of consideration for both Dust's double burden and Abigail's condition. The Wyoming landscape unfolded around them, vast, rugged, and hauntingly beautiful in the clear light of early day. By mid-morning, they had covered several miles, but Abigail's strength was flagging. The constant motion of the horse taxed muscles. Weakened by illness and staying upright required increasingly conscious effort. Nathaniel, attuned to her condition, reined Dust to a halt beside a small stream shaded by cottonwoods. "We'll rest here," he announced, dismounting and reaching up to help Abigail down. Her legs buckled as her feet touched the ground, and Nathaniel caught her against his chest, his arms steadying her until she found her balance. "I'm sorry," she murmured, embarrassed by her weakness. "Don't apologize for being human," he replied simply, leading her to a flat rock in the shade. "Rest, drink some water. We've made good progress." They spent an hour at the stream, Abigail resting while Nathaniel allowed Dust to graze and drink. When they resumed their journey, Abigail felt marginally restored, though she knew the afternoon would test her endurance severely. As they rode, Nathaniel occasionally pointed out features of the landscape or signs of wildlife, a hawk circling. Overhead, the tracks of a coyote crossing their path, a distant herd of pronghorn grazing on a hillside. The simple observations created a connection to the land and distracted Abigail from her physical discomfort. "How did you learn to read the land so well?" she asked during one of their rest stops. Nathaniel scanned the horizon before answering, a habit so ingrained he seemed unaware of doing it. "Started as a boy in Pennsylvania, hunting with my father. Then the war, scouting, taught me to see what others missed. After that, necessity." He shrugged. "Out here, missing signs can get you killed." By late afternoon, they had covered perhaps 15 miles, half the distance to Silver Creek, but as much as Abigail could manage in her condition. Nathaniel found a sheltered hollow near another small stream, with a natural rock formation providing protection from the wind on one side. "We'll camp here for the night," he decided, helping Abigail dismount. Her legs gave way completely this time, and he lifted her in his arms without comment, carrying her to a smooth patch of ground in the shelter of the rocks. "I'll be fine after I rest," she assured him, mortified by her helplessness, yet grateful for his matter-of-fact assistance. Nathaniel nodded, accepting her assertion without question. "I'll see to Dust and gather firewood. You rest." As he busied himself making camp, Abigail leaned back against the sun-warmed stone and closed her eyes. Despite her exhaustion, a curious sense of freedom filled her. Out here under the vast sky, social conventions seemed as distant as Boston itself. She was simply a woman recovering her strength, traveling with a man she trusted, moving toward an uncertain future of her own choosing. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. By the time Nathaniel had a small fire crackling, Abigail felt recovered enough to sit up and offer assistance with their simple meal preparations. They ate dried beef and the last of their hardtack, supplemented with wild onions Nathaniel had spotted during their day's travel. As night descended, the temperature dropped rapidly, reminding Abigail of the harsh realities of frontier life. Nathaniel added wood to the fire and unrolled his bedroll near it. "Take this," he said, offering her the blanket. "I'll keep watch for the first part of the night, then wake you so I can get some rest." Abigail accepted the blanket but frowned. At his plan, "You need rest too," she protested, "and I'm hardly capable of standing watch effectively." "You'll hear anyone approaching," Nathaniel countered. "That's all I need, an early warning. I sleep light." Understanding that his caution was born of years living as a hunted man, Abigail nodded. "Wake me in 4 hours then, I insist." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Yes, ma'am." As she settled onto the bedroll, wrapped in his blanket that carried the faint scent of pine and leather, Abigail watched Nathaniel's profile against the firelight. He sat with his back to the rock formation, rifle across his knees, his posture alert yet relaxed, a man accustomed to balancing vigilance with the need for rest. "Nathaniel," she said softly as sleep began to claim her. "Thank you for bringing me this far." He turned slightly, the firelight highlighting the strong planes of his face. "We've always yet to go," he reminded her, his voice equally quiet in the night stillness. "Yes," Abigail agreed, her eyes drifting closed, "but I'm glad to be traveling with you, whatever the destination." She didn't see his expression in response to her words, but the silence that followed felt comfortably warm, like the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. As she slipped into sleep, Abigail's last conscious thought was that for all the uncertainty ahead, in this moment, she felt strangely, unexpectedly at peace. Abigail woke to the gentle touch of Nathaniel's hand on her shoulder. The sky above was still dark, blanketed with stars that seemed close enough to touch. "Your watch," he said softly, keeping his voice low in the stillness of the night. She pushed herself upright, surprised to find that she felt reasonably rested despite sleeping on the hard ground. "How long did you let me sleep?" she asked suspiciously. Hint of humor touched his eyes. "Long enough, which means you barely rested at all," Abigail chided, but she moved to take his position by the rock wall. "What should I be watching for?" Nathaniel settled onto the bedroll she'd vacated, stretching his long frame beside the glowing embers of their fire. Movement, unusual sounds, approaching riders. Unlikely out here, but caution keeps a person alive. He showed her how to hold the rifle across her lap, not expecting her to use it, but ensuring it was within his reach if needed. "Wake me if anything concerns you, no matter how small." Abigail nodded, sobered by the responsibility. "I will. Now rest." To her surprise, Nathaniel seemed to fall asleep almost immediately, his breathing deepening into the regular rhythm of genuine slumber. She studied his face in repose, noting how the hard lines of vigilance softened in sleep, making him appear younger, less burdened. The night passed slowly, marked by the gradual wheeling of the stars overhead and the occasional distant cry of a coyote. Abigail found herself enjoying the solitude and the vastness of the night sky, so different from the closed-in feeling of Boston's narrow streets or even the stagecoach station where she'd been confined during her illness. Just before dawn, Nathaniel stirred, his eyes opening with the immediate alertness of a man accustomed to danger. He glanced at her position, then at the sky. "All quiet?" he asked, sitting up and reaching for his boots. Peaceful, Abigail confirmed. Though I heard about coyotes a few times, he nodded, satisfied with her report. You should have woken me earlier. You needed the rest, she countered, shifting to allow him to reclaim his rifle. Besides, I enjoyed the stars. We never see so many in Boston. Too much coal smoke and too many buildings. Nathaniel checked the rifle and rose to his feet, scanning the surrounding landscape with habitual caution. Apparently satisfied, he moved to rekindle the fire. We'll have coffee before setting out. How are you feeling after yesterday's ride? Abigail took inventory of her body's condition. She was stiff from the unaccustomed activity and sleeping on the ground, but the bone-deep weakness of typhoid had receded further. Better than I expected, she reported. Sore, but stronger. Good. We should reach Silver Creek by nightfall if we maintain yesterday's pace. He glanced at her with his assessing gaze. Though we'll stop more frequently today. No sense pushing. Too hard and setting back your recovery. They shared a breakfast of coffee and the last of their provisions, then broke camp with efficient movements. As Abigail rolled the bedding, she was pleased to find that her hands were steadier and her balance more reliable than the previous day. When it came time to mount, Nathaniel lifted her onto Dust's back with the same care as before. But Abigail noted that the motion seemed easier for both of them, her body remembering how to move with purpose after days of illness-induced lethargy. The second day's journey began in companionable silence, both of them alert and watchful as the landscape gradually changed around them. The rolling plains gave way to more varied terrain, with stands of pine becoming more frequent and rocky outcroppings breaking the horizon. By mid-morning, they crested a rise that afforded their first distant view of Silver Creek. From this vantage point, it appeared as little more than a smudge against the landscape, but the sight sent a jolt of conflicting emotions through Abigail. This was where Daniel had died, where their dreams had withered before they could take root. Yet it also represented possibility, the land she owned, the decisions awaiting her, the future she might yet build. We'll approach from the north, Nathaniel said, interrupting her thoughts. Less traveled, which suits my purposes, and it will bring us directly to your property without passing through the center of town. Abigail nodded, appreciating both his caution and his consideration for her situation. Is the typhoid outbreak likely to be over? She asked, suddenly concerned about the reception they might receive. Should be. These things tend to burn themselves out after a few weeks, especially when people realize the water supply is contaminated, but we'll be careful nonetheless. They continued on, stopping every few hours for Abigail to rest and Dust to graze. During one such stop, near a small stream lined with cottonwoods, Nathaniel broached the subject they'd been skirting. When we reach Silver Creek, he began, his tone carefully neutral, what are your plans? Abigail smoothed her skirt, buying time to organize her thoughts. I need to assess the property first, see what condition it's in, then determine whether it's more advantageous to sell immediately or hold it for a better price. Nathaniel nodded, accepting the practical response. And after that, the question hung between them, weighted with unspoken possibilities. Abigail looked up, meeting his pale blue eyes directly. I don't know, she admitted. I have options, I suppose. Return to Boston, though that holds little appeal. Settle elsewhere using whatever funds I secure from the property. Or... She hesitated, uncertain how to express the nebulous thoughts that had been forming during their journey. Or? Nathaniel prompted, his expression unreadable. Or find a way to stay in the West, she finished. Not necessarily in Silver Creek, but somewhere I might build something of my own. The corner of Nathaniel's mouth lifted slightly. The West has gotten under your skin, then? Perhaps, Abigail acknowledged. Or perhaps I'm simply reluctant to retreat to what I left behind. Nathaniel seemed to weigh his next words carefully. The West offers freedom, but at a price, especially for a woman alone. I'm aware, Abigail said quietly, but is returning to a life I never truly wanted any less costly? He had no immediate answer for that, and they lapsed into thoughtful silence as they prepared to resume their journey. As the afternoon waned, signs of civilization began to appear more frequently. A rutted wagon road, fenced pasture land in the distance, the occasional wisp of smoke from an isolated homestead. Nathaniel grew more vigilant with each mile, his posture tense as they drew closer to Silver Creek. We should arrive within the hour, he noted, guiding Dust onto a less-traveled path that skirted a stand of pines. It would be best if I'm not seen with you, given my situation. I can leave you within sight of town. No, Abigail interrupted, surprising herself with the vehemence of her response. I mean, I'd prefer if you accompanied me to the property at least. After everything we've been through, I'd like your assessment of the land before you go. Nathaniel glanced back at her, something unreadable flickering in his gaze. After a moment, he nodded. Very well, but we'll need to be cautious. I can't afford to be recognized. As the sun dipped toward the western horizon, they followed a narrow trail that led them toward the outskirts of Silver Creek. The railroad tracks gleamed dully in the late afternoon light, a bold line cutting through the landscape. Near the junction where two rail lines met, Nathaniel pointed to a modest parcel marked by survey stakes. Your property, I believe, he said, reining Dust to a halt at a safe distance. Abigail studied the land with keen interest. It was precisely as Daniel had described, well positioned near the junction, with good drainage and relatively flat terrain, ideal for building. A small stream ran along one edge, providing water access. The railroad depot was visible about a quarter-mile away, with the main street of Silver Creek stretching beyond it. It's perfect, she murmured, understanding now why Daniel had been so enthusiastic about the location. Or it would have been, for our original plans. Nathaniel dismounted and helped her down, his hands strong and steady. Together, they walked. The perimeter of the property, Abigail noting landmarks and assessing the potential without Daniel's rose-colored vision to influence her. What do you think? She asked Nathaniel as they completed their circuit. He surveyed the land with a critical, good location for commercial purposes. Any business here would benefit from the railroad traffic. The town itself appears to be recovering from the typhoid outbreak. I see activity in the depot and smoke from chimneys. Your husband chose well. The simple validation of Daniel's judgment meant more to Abigail than she'd expected. Thank you for saying that. As twilight gathered around them, Nathaniel led them to a small clearing in a stand of pines at the edge of the property. We'll camp here tonight, he decided. Tomorrow, you can go into town to speak with the land office and assess your options, while I remain out of sight. Abigail nodded, though the prospect of separating, even temporarily, filled her with unexpected anxiety. How will I find you afterward? I'll be watching, he assured her. Once you're clear of town, I'll find you. The simple statement shouldn't have been as comforting as it was. They made camp with practiced efficiency, the routine now familiar after their journey. As darkness descended and their small fire cast dancing shadows among the pines, Abigail found herself contemplating the decision point that lay before her. Nathaniel, she said tentatively, may I ask you something personal? He looked up from gleaning his revolver, his expression cautious but not closed. You may ask, I may not answer. Fair enough. If circumstances were different, if you weren't a wanted man, what would you want for your life? The question seemed to catch him off guard. He set the revolver aside, giving the matter genuine consideration. I've spent so long focusing on survival that once seemed like luxuries, he finally said. But if I could choose freely, he gazed into the fire. Land of my own, perhaps. A small ranch in Montana Territory. Horses. enough distance from neighbors to breathe, but close enough for trade. The simple description painted a vivid picture of a life rooted in the land yet independent, not unlike what Daniel had sought, though less focused on commerce and more on self-sufficiency. Not a solitary existence, though, Nathaniel continued, his voice lower. That was never my preference. Despite how things have turned out, Abigail's heart quickened at the implication. You'd want a family? He met her gaze across the fire, his expression more open than she'd yet seen it. I had that once, lost it to circumstances beyond my control. If life offered a second chance... He shrugged, the gesture eloquent in its simplicity. Yes, a family, roots, legacy. The honesty of his answer moved her deeply. Thank you for telling me. Nathaniel nodded, then turned the question back to her. And you? What would you want if circumstances were different, if Daniel had lived? Abigail sighed. Considering, I thought I knew. The hotel and restaurant here in Silver Creek, children eventually, a life built on Daniel's ambitions and my support of them. And now? Now I'm not certain, she admitted. Daniel's dreams were compelling, but they were his, not necessarily mine. Since his death, I found myself wondering what I truly want, separate from what's expected of me or what others have planned. And what have you concluded? Abigail smiled ruefully. That's the trouble. I haven't, not entirely. I know I don't want to return to Boston and the constraints of that life. I know I've found unexpected strength in myself during this ordeal, and I know that the West, for all its harshness, offers possibilities that simply don't exist back east, especially for a woman seeking independence. Nathaniel considered this. Independence comes at a cost, he observed. Loneliness, hardship, constant vigilance, I would know. Yes, Abigail acknowledged, but so does dependence in its own way. They lapsed into companionable silence, each lost in private thoughts as the fire burned low. Finally, Nathaniel spoke again. Whatever you decide in town tomorrow, remember that you have choices. Don't let others' expectations or immediate circumstances dictate your path. The advice, coming from a man whose own choices had been severely constrained by circumstance, carried particular weight. I won't, she promised. Morning arrived with a clarity that matched Abigail's resolve. She ate a quick breakfast and dressed as presentably as possible in her wrinkled gown, using the small mirror from Nathaniel's pack to arrange her hair in a semblance of propriety. The land office will be on the main street, Nathaniel instructed, as he helped her onto dust for the short ride to the edge of town. Ask for records regarding your property, then gauge interest in potential sale. The saloon would normally be a good place to assess the town's condition, but not appropriate for a lady alone, Abigail finished with a wry smile. I'll try the general store instead. Shopkeepers always know the town gossip. Nathaniel nodded approvingly. I'll leave you at the edge of town and find a place to wait out of sight. Be careful what you reveal about your recent experiences. A woman traveling alone attracts enough attention without adding mysterious rescuers to the tale. The warning was prudent, but Abigail felt a pang at the thought of denying Nathaniel's role in her survival. I understand. They reached the outskirts of Silver Creek as the town was coming to life, early risers moving purposefully along the boardwalks that lined the main street. Nathaniel reined dust to a halt in the shelter of a small grove of trees. This is as far as I go, he said, helping Abigail dismount. Remember, once you've concluded your business, return this way. I'll be watching. Abigail straightened her skirts and adjusted her shawl, suddenly anxious about entering civilization after days of Nathaniel's exclusive company. What if someone asks how I arrived in town? Tell them a partial truth, that your husband died of typhoid, that you were ill yourself but recovered, that you've come to settle his affairs. He hesitated. Leave me out of it entirely. Abigail nodded, understanding the necessity but disliking the deception. On impulse, she reached out and squeezed his hand. Thank you for bringing me this far. I won't be long. Nathaniel's fingers tightened briefly around hers. Take whatever time you need, I'll wait. With a deep breath, Abigail turned and walked toward Silver Creek, feeling Nathaniel's gaze following her until she rounded a bend in the path and entered the town proper. Silver Creek was smaller than she'd imagined from Daniel's enthusiastic descriptions, but it had the bustling energy of a place rapidly expanding. The main street was lined with false-fronted wooden buildings, most newly constructed. People moved purposefully along the boardwalks, merchants opening shops, cowboys heading to the livery, women carrying baskets for morning shopping. Abigail attracted curious glances as she made her way toward the land office, identified by a painted sign, near the center of town. Her wrinkled dress and travel-worn appearance marked her as an outsider, but no one approached her directly. The land office was a small but tidy establishment, presided over by a bald man in his 50s who glanced up from his ledger as she entered. "Good morning, ma'am," he greeted, setting aside his pen. "How may I assist you?" Abigail stepped forward with as much dignity as she could muster. "My name is Abigail Carter. My husband Daniel purchased a parcel near the railroad junction 3 weeks ago. I've come to review the records and inquire about its current status." The man's expression shifted from professional courtesy to something more complex, recognition, followed by sympathy. "Mrs. Carter, yes. I'm Harold Wells, the land agent. I handled your husband's purchase." He gestured to a chair beside his desk. "Please sit down. I'm very sorry for your loss." Abigail took the offered seat, both relieved and surprised to be remembered. "You heard about Daniel's death?" Wells nodded solemnly. "News travels fast in a small town, especially during an outbreak. The doctor mentioned that Mr. Carter was one of the first to succumb to typhoid." He peered at her with genuine concern. "I'd heard his wife, you, had fallen ill as well. I'm glad to see that information was incorrect." "It wasn't," Abigail corrected. "I contracted typhoid, but I recovered." She offered no further details, following Nathaniel's advice. "A blessing indeed," Wells said. "Now, regarding your property, the deed is properly recorded, with title transferring to you as Mr. Carter's widow. The parcel remains in good standing. All fees paid through the end of the year." He pulled a rolled map from a cubbyhole behind his desk and spread it on the surface between them. "Here's your land, Mrs. Carter. As you can see, its position near the junction remains highly advantageous. In fact, since your husband's purchase, the railroad has announced expanded service beginning next month, which should only increase the property's value." Abigail studied the map, noting how her parcel related to the growing town. "Has there been interest from others in purchasing land in that area?" Wells raised an eyebrow, understanding the implication of her question. "Indeed. Several inquiries since the epidemic subsided. The Carson brothers, they own the largest mercantile in town, have expressed interest in expanding their operations to a site nearer the depot. And there's a hotel developer from Denver who's been corresponding about suitable locations." This was valuable information, confirmation that Daniel's assessment of the property's potential had been accurate and that a sale would likely command a good price. "I may be interested in selling," Abigail said carefully, watching Wells's reaction. "Depending on the offer, of course." The land agent nodded thoughtfully. "That's certainly understandable in your circumstances, Mrs. Carter. Would you like me to make some discreet inquiries on your behalf? I believe I could secure several competing offers quite quickly." "I would appreciate that," Abigail confirmed. "I'll be in the area for a few days while I consider my options." "Excellent. Where are you staying?" "The Silverton Hotel is modest but respectable for a lady alone." Abigail hesitated, unwilling to lie outright, yet unable to reveal her actual circumstances. "I've only just arrived in town. I plan to secure accommodations after attending to this business. Wells accepted this without question. "Then I recommend speaking with Mrs. Tillman at the Silverton. Tell her I sent you. She'll ensure you're treated properly." With that advice and assurances that he would contact her at the hotel regarding potential offers, Abigail concluded her business at the land office and stepped back onto Silver Creek's Main Street, feeling both accomplished and overwhelmed by the decisions that lay ahead. Abigail made her way down Silver Creek's Main Street, taking in the sights and sounds of the frontier town with new eyes. Now that her immediate business at the land office was concluded, she allowed herself to observe the settlement that might have become her home with Daniel. The general store occupied a prime corner location, its windows displaying everything from cast-iron cookware to bolts of calico fabric. A steady stream of customers moved in and out, suggesting that commerce had recovered well from the typhoid outbreak. Across the street, a saloon was already doing business despite the early hour, piano music drifting through its swinging doors. Following Wells's recommendation, Abigail located the Silverton Hotel, a two-story wooden structure with a small dining room visible through the front window. She hesitated at the entrance, suddenly aware of how her appearance might be perceived. Her dress was wrinkled from travel, her hair simply bound with a bandana rather than properly styled, and she carried no luggage, hardly the image of a respectable widow. Taking a deep breath, she pushed through the door into a modest lobby furnished with several worn but clean armchairs and a registration desk. Behind the desk stood a plump woman in her 50s, her gray hair pulled into a tight bun at the nape of her neck. "Good morning," the woman greeted, her sharp eyes taking in Abigail's travel-worn appearance. "May I help you?" "I hope so," Abigail replied with as much dignity as she could muster. "My name is Abigail Carter. Mr. Wells at the land office suggested I speak with Mrs. Tillman about accommodations." The woman's expression softened slightly. "I'm Ida Tillman. You're Daniel Carter's widow, then? The one who bought land by the junction before the typhoid struck?" News truly did travel fast in a small town. "Yes, that's correct." Mrs. Tillman came around the desk, gesturing for Abigail to follow her to a quiet corner of the lobby. "Mr. Wells mentioned you might be coming to town. I'm mighty sorry about your husband, Mrs. Carter. A terrible business, that outbreak. We lost 8 souls altogether before Doc Pearson figured out it was the South well contaminated. Thank you for your condolences," Abigail said quietly. "I was fortunate to recover." Mrs. Tillman nodded, studying her with shrewd eyes. "You look like you've had a rough journey, if you don't mind my saying so. No luggage?" Abigail hesitated, then decided a partial truth was necessary. "I was staying at a homestead outside town while recuperating. My belongings were lost during my illness. I've come to town to settle my husband's affairs and determine my next steps." The explanation seemed to satisfy Mrs. Tillman, who patted Abigail's hand sympathetically. "Well, we can certainly help with the necessities. I have a clean room available, and there's hot water for bathing. Margaret at the Mercantile carries some ready-made ladies' garments that might tide you over." "That would be wonderful," Abigail said with genuine relief. "Though I must be honest, my funds are limited until I conclude my business here." Mrs. Tillman waved away her concern. "Any wife who sticks by her husband through typhoid deserves some consideration. We'll work something out for a few days. Stay. Meanwhile, you look like you could use a proper meal. Our dining room serves breakfast until 10. Abigail's throat tightened with unexpected emotion at this simple kindness. "Thank you, Mrs. Tillman. I'm very grateful." Within an hour, Abigail found herself transformed. A hot bath had washed away the dust of travel, and Mrs. Tillman had provided a plain but clean nightgown and wrapper, taking Abigail's travel-worn dress to be laundered. After a substantial breakfast of eggs, biscuits, and coffee in the hotel's small dining room, Abigail felt more human than she had in weeks. In her room, a modest but clean chamber with a narrow bed, washstand, and small writing desk, she evaluated Her situation. Assuming Wells could arrange a sale of her property, she would have funds to consider her future options. The question remained, what did she truly want that future to be, and what role, if any, might Nathaniel Hayes play in it? The thought of the quiet, steadfast man waiting at the edge of town brought a surge of conflicting emotions. During their days together, something had developed between them, a connection that transcended their circumstance, a mutual understanding that needed no words. Yet the practical obstacles to any continued association seemed insurmountable. He was a wanted man with a price on his head. She was a respectable widow with a reputation to maintain. More importantly, while she believed his account of the shooting, being self-defense, the fact remained that he lived outside the law. Any life that included Nathaniel would necessarily be a life of looking over one's shoulder, never fully settling, always prepared to flee at the first sign of danger. Could she accept such an existence, having already endured so much upheaval? These thoughts occupied Abigail as she rested through the afternoon, conserving her strength after the exertions of travel. By late afternoon, refreshed and wearing her newly laundered dress, she made her way back to the land office to check if Wells had made progress with potential buyers. The land agent looked up with a satisfied smile as she entered. "Mrs. Carter, excellent timing. I've already had responses to my inquiries regarding your property." Abigail took the seat beside his desk, impressed by his efficiency. "That was remarkably quick. As I mentioned, there's been considerable interest in land near the junction since the railroad announced expanded service." Wells shuffled through several papers on his desk. "The Carson brothers have offered $800, which is $100 more than your husband paid. And there's a Denver hotel developer, Mr. James Sullivan, who's prepared to pay $1,000 contingent on inspection." The amounts exceeded Abigail's expectations. Daniel had indeed chosen well. The property's value had increased significantly in just a few weeks. Such a sum would give her options, freedom to chart her own course. "These are both very generous offers," she acknowledged. "How quickly could a sale be completed?" The Carson brothers could conclude immediately, their local men with ready cash. Sullivan would need to travel from Denver, which might take a week or more. Wells leaned forward slightly. "If I may offer some advice, Mrs. Carter, Sullivan's offer is higher, but the Carsons are a known quantity in Silver Creek. Their word and their bank drafts equally solid. Sometimes certainty trumps a higher speculative offer." Abigail considered this. "I appreciate your counsel, Mr. Wells. May I have until tomorrow to consider my decision?" "Of course, I'll inform both parties that you're reviewing their proposals." He hesitated, then added, "If I might inquire about your plans after the sale. Silver Creek is growing rapidly. There might be opportunities for a lady of means to establish herself here, even without your original hotel plans." The suggestion took Abigail by surprise. She hadn't considered remaining in Silver Creek once the property was sold. "What sort of opportunities do you envision?" Wells warmed to the topic. "Several come to mind. The town has no proper boarding house for respectable single women. The railroad brings female teachers, seamstresses, and shop clerks regularly, but they struggle to find suitable accommodation. A lady like yourself, with social standing and business acumen, might fill that need admirably." The possibility had merit. Such an establishment would be far smaller than the hotel she and Daniel had planned, requiring less capital and less risk. It would provide her independence while still maintaining propriety, but it would also mean establishing herself permanently in Silver Creek, a town where Nathaniel could never safely reside. "It's an intriguing suggestion," she told Wells non-committally. "I'll give it consideration along with my other options." Leaving the land office, Abigail walked slowly through town, observing the community with new attention. Wells wasn't wrong about Silver Creek's potential. Despite the recent epidemic, the town was visibly thriving, with new construction evident on several side streets. The railroad depot bustled with activity, and merchants seemed to be doing brisk business. It could be a good place to build a new life. As the sun began to set, painting the western sky in brilliant hues, Abigail knew she could delay no longer. Nathaniel would be waiting, wondering about her extended absence. She needed to return to their campsite and share the developments of her day, and perhaps, more importantly, discuss what came next for both of them. She slipped out of town as unobtrusively as possible, following the path they'd taken that morning. As promised, Nathaniel found her before she'd gone far, materializing silently from the shadows of a stand of pines. "You were gone longer than expected," he observed, his tone neutral, though his eyes reflected concern. "Any trouble?" "None," Abigail assured him, suddenly aware of how much she'd missed his steady presence throughout the day. Quite the opposite. The land agent had 2 buyers interested immediately. One has offered $1,000. Nathaniel's eyebrows rose, slightly, the only indication of his surprise. "A substantial sum. Your husband chose well indeed." They walked together toward their campsite, Abigail recounting her meetings with Wells and Mrs. Tillman. Nathaniel listened attentively, asking occasional questions, but offering no opinions until she'd finished. "So you've secured a respectable room at the hotel and have promising offers for your land," he summarized as they reached the clearing where their small camp was established. "Seems your path forward is taking shape." Something in his tone, a careful neutrality that masked deeper feelings, prompted Abigail to look at him directly. "That's what I wanted to discuss with you, Nathaniel. My path forward." He busied himself rekindling their fire, not meeting her gaze. "You're fortunate to have options. Many widows find themselves with far fewer choices." "Yes," Abigail agreed, settling on a fallen log near the fire pit, "and I'm grateful. But the question remains, which option to choose?" Nathaniel arranged kindling with methodical precision. Returning to Boston would be the safest choice. Family, familiar surroundings, social connections, all valuable for a woman alone. "The safest, perhaps," Abigail conceded, "but not what I want." This drew his attention, and he looked up from the fire, his expression carefully guarded. "What do you want, Abigail?" It was the question she'd been asking herself all day, examining from every angle like a complex puzzle. Now, facing Nathaniel's direct gaze across the small fire he'd kindled, the answer crystallized with sudden clarity. "I want what I never had in Boston. Independence, purpose of my own choosing, the freedom to define my own life without the constraints of others' expectations." She drew a deep breath. "The land agent suggested I could establish a boarding house for respectable women in Silver Creek. The town is growing, and such accommodation is needed." "A practical suggestion," Nathaniel observed, his tone still carefully neutral. "It would provide income while maintaining social standing." "Yes," Abigail agreed, "and in many ways it's a sensible path, but, he prompted when she hesitated, "but it would mean establishing myself permanently in Silver Creek, a town where you could never safely stay." The admission hung between them, weighted with implications neither had previously voiced. Nathaniel was silent for a long moment, the fire casting flickering shadows across his features. "You shouldn't make such decisions based on a temporary association, Abigail. We've known each other barely a week. A week in which you saved my life, nursed me through illness, protected me on the journey here," she countered. "Circumstances may have thrown us together, but what's developed between us isn't merely gratitude or convenience, at least, not for me." The admission cost her more courage than she'd expected, laying bare feelings that propriety suggested should remain unspoken. But Abigail had learned the hard way that life was too uncertain, too fragile to waste on convention when matters of the heart were at stake. Nathaniel's expression softened, the careful neutrality giving way to something more vulnerable. "Not for me either," he admitted quietly. "But that doesn't change the reality of my situation. I'm a wanted man with a price on my head. Any life that includes me is necessarily a life of uncertainty, of looking over your shoulder, of never fully belonging anywhere." "I understand that," Abigail said, "but having faced death so recently, I've come to believe that certainty is an illusion we cling to out of fear. Daniel and I had certainty, a clear plan, a future mapped out step by step. All of it crumbled. In days." She moved closer, sitting beside him near the fire. "I'm not proposing anything reckless. I'll sell the property, secure my financial independence. But then, instead of settling in Silver Creek or returning to Boston, I thought perhaps Montana." Nathaniel looked at her sharply. "Montana? You mentioned a dream of land in Montana Territory, a small ranch, horses, distance from neighbors but not complete isolation." Abigail met his gaze steadily. "It sounded like a good life. One I might share if you were amenable." For a moment, Nathaniel seemed speechless, caught between hope and disbelief. "Abigail, you can't possibly—" "Can't I?" she interrupted gently. "I'm a widow with no family ties. No one would question my decision to seek a fresh start in new territory. And Montana is beyond Colorado's jurisdiction, as you yourself noted. The price on my head would follow me, even there," Nathaniel warned. "And any woman associated with me would face scrutiny, possibly danger." "Life holds danger regardless of our choices," Abigail replied. "I nearly died alone in an abandoned stagecoach station. At least this danger would come with purpose, with companionship freely chosen." Nathaniel rose and paced beside the fire, the internal conflict visible in his tense movements. "What you're suggesting is—" "A partnership," Abigail supplied. "The form it takes would be for us to determine as we move forward. I'm not asking for promises or declarations, Nathaniel. Only the chance to see if what's begun between us might grow into something enduring." He stopped pacing and faced her directly, his pale blue eyes reflecting both yearning and caution. "You deserve better than a life on the fringes with a wanted man. I deserve the right to choose my own path," Abigail countered, "as do you." A log shifted in the fire, sending sparks spiraling upward into the darkening sky. In that moment of quiet, with the first stars appearing overhead, something shifted between them, a barrier falling, a possibility opening. "It wouldn't be easy," Nathaniel said finally. "Few worthwhile things are," she replied. He moved closer, extending his hand to help her rise. When she stood before him, he studied her face with an intensity that might have unsettled her days earlier, but now felt like recognition, like coming home. "If we do this," he said softly, "we do it properly. I won't have you compromising your principles or reputation, regardless of my circumstances." Abigail's heart quickened at the implication. "What are you suggesting? That before we leave for Montana, we find that circuit-riding preacher Mrs. Tillman mentioned, make our partnership legal and binding." His expression was solemn, but his eyes held a warmth she'd rarely glimpsed. "If you're certain this is what you want—" "It is," Abigail said simply, "more than I realized until today." Nathaniel's hand tightened around hers. "Then we'll make our plans accordingly. You'll sell the property to the Carson brothers. Their immediate offer means we can leave sooner. I'll secure supplies for the journey north, and when we reach Montana Territory, we'll find that parcel of land I described and build something that's truly ours." The conviction in his voice, the way he said "ours," as if the word itself was precious, told Abigail everything she needed to know about his feelings, even without flowery declarations. In the days that followed, their plans took shape with surprising efficiency. Abigail accepted the Carson brothers' offer, completing the transaction with Wells' assistance. The $800, secured in a bank draft and a small amount of cash for traveling expenses, represented freedom and possibility rather than merely compensation for Daniel's property. Nathaniel, moving carefully to avoid attention, acquired supplies for their journey: a sturdy wagon, provisions, tools they would need to establish a homestead, and a gentle mare to complement Dust for the journey north. He found them a campsite farther from town where they could prepare without arousing suspicion. True to his word, he also located the circuit riding preacher, Reverend Thomas Miller, who visited outlying homesteads monthly. For a modest donation to his mission work, Reverend Miller agreed to perform a private ceremony at a small chapel he maintained 3 miles outside Silver Creek. On a clear autumn morning, with only the Reverend and his wife as witnesses, Abigail and Nathaniel exchanged simple vows. She wore her freshly laundered dress with flowers the Reverend's wife had gathered adorning her hair. Nathaniel had managed to procure a new shirt and had trimmed his beard, transforming his appearance subtly but significantly. When the brief ceremony concluded, Reverend Miller presented them with a marriage certificate in the name of Nathaniel and Abigail Hayes. The document was completely legal, though it represented a new identity and a fresh start for both of them. "Mrs. Hayes," Nathaniel said, as he helped her into their wagon afterward, the name unfamiliar but welcome on his lips. "Mr. Hayes," she replied with a smile, the simple exchange containing volumes of meaning between them. They left that same day, heading north toward Montana Territory with their few possessions and the shared hope of a future neither had dared imagine weeks earlier. The journey would be long and not without challenges, but as they crossed the Wyoming border with the first snow dusting the mountains ahead, Abigail felt a certainty that had nothing to do with plans or expectations. This unexpected path, born of illness and desperation, shaped by compassion and growing affection, was the one she was meant to travel. With Nathaniel beside her, the future stretched before them like the vast Montana landscape, rugged, unpredictable, but filled with beauty and possibility for those brave enough to claim it. As their wagon crested a rise, revealing a sweeping vista of mountains and valleys, Nathaniel reached for her hand. "No regrets?" he asked, echoing a question from days earlier. Abigail laced her fingers through his, feeling the strength and tenderness in his grasp, a touch that had once saved her life and now promised to share it. "None," she replied, her heart full with the certainty of her choice. "This is exactly where I'm meant to be." The wagon continued northward, carrying them toward a future neither could fully envision, but both had chosen freely. Behind them lay tragedy and danger. Ahead lay challenge and uncertainty. But in this moment, on this road, they had found something precious and unexpected, a second chance, a shared purpose, a love born from the ashes of desperation and nurtured by mutual respect and understanding. The Wyoming wind whipped around them, carrying the first hints of winter's approach, but within their wagon, their first shared home. Warmth and hope flourished, proof that even in the harshest circumstances, new beginnings were possible for those with the courage to embrace them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.